Hello, I'm Sarah J. Mee with one of two very special editions of the Sky News Daily. Two massive stories today, a general election date announced by the Prime Minister. My colleague Neil Patterson will have the Sky News Daily episode about that. But let's not forget the Post Office scandal, a significant day today. The day that former Post Office boss Paula Vennells testifies at the inquiry into why so many sub-postmasters were wrongfully convicted. I'm in Fenny Compton's Village Hall, which is where Alan Bates began his campaign for justice way back in 2009. With me to watch Vennells' evidence are a group of sub-postmasters who want answers from Vennells, who took the job back in 2012. And it was under her watch that prosecutions continued, despite mounting evidence that bugs in the Horizon IT system were behind the cash shortfalls and not the sub-postmasters. Now, this place has real significance for the post office victims. It's exactly as you'd imagine a village hall to look like. A big room with a piano in the corner. There's a notice board adorned with bunting and local flyers pinned to it. But today, it's a little different. It's got a big screen with chairs gathered round it. And on that screen is Paula Vennells, as she's cross-examined by the inquiry's lead counsel, Jason Beer.
Why were you telling these parliamentarians that every prosecution involving the Horizon system had been successful and had found in favour of the post office?
I fully accept now that the post office, the post office knew that. I completely accepted. Personally, I didn't know that, and I'm incredibly sorry that happened to those people and to so many others.
Well, Paula Vennells was the Post Office chief executive. She had a CBE. She was a Church of England lay preacher. She has lost all of those titles. She appeared with only her reputation and perhaps her liberty to defend. On this episode, we'll speak to the sub-postmasters here about whether they're any closer to the truth about what happened to them. And we'll hear from a former sub-postmistress who has never told her story before. But first, let's talk to our correspondent, Tom Parminter, about what we've learnt today.
We heard some new apologies. She's made 3 apologies at the start of her evidence, which drew quite a reaction from the postmasters who we were sat with in the village hall here in Fenny Compton. It's the first time they and the rest of the country has heard at length since she left this very high-profile job in 2019. We heard apologies to people who have tried to unpick and unravel this scandal, and I think there's an acknowledgement within what she said today that it hasn't always been as straightforward and as transparent as it should have been. And she also apologised for what is to come during this 3 days of evidence, the fact that she will be addressing very difficult subjects for the victims of this, and really the apologies from what we've heard from the sub-postmasters that we've been speaking to through the course of today here just do not cut it for them. Despite the tears that we've also seen from Paula Vennells, that was one of the most remarkable and repeated parts of this evidence that I'm sure a lot of people will see and watch, that this woman was in tears as she was giving this evidence, and that was met with a lot of scepticism among the sub-postmasters who are watching this, because they too have shed a hell of a lot of tears through the course of the last couple of decades. It's been monumental what has happened. You speak to people who have had to sleep in their car because they've been made homeless. You speak to people whose husband died as a convicted criminal, never seeing the day when he was actually exonerated. And this is painful stuff that's quite moving, really. It's very moving. And it's a bigger mix of emotions that the organisation that Paula Vennells was in charge of was responsible for that suffering.
Very little sympathy, as you said there, for Tom, from the people gathered here in Fenny Compton Village Hall. They're the epitome of a tough crowd because of what they've been through. This has been so difficult for them, and the least they deserve is honesty and truthful answers. That's what they want, and that is needed by posing difficult questions. What were some of those difficult questions today?
Paula Vennells was asked about this reputation management culture at the post office. Was it just to protect the institution, protecting their own skins at the expense of these people who were their employees, trusted members of their staff, but still sold down the river in these investigations that we know were based on this false premise that the Horizon computer system was faulty? She was asked directly about that.
That's what I'm asking, not whether you wish
Yes.
you had known. It's why didn't you?
That goes back to my earlier point, I believe, around management information, around possibly Fujitsu not sharing as much as it could or should have done, around possibly people knowing that the system itself lacked integrity, around corporate memory. One of the biggest lessons for governance in this was when I joined the post office in 2007, there was absolutely no corporate memory alive, at least, of the inception of the Horizon system. I had no idea that it was a system that had been designed for a completely different purpose, that the post office had had to struggle to take it on, that the decisions...
How come we've been able to find it out? Just by asking for the documents?
She was overprotective of the reputation of the post office. And she says, well, yes, she was protective of that reputation, but not at the expense of the sub-postmasters. And that, again, was just another point in the hall here in Fenny Compton where there was just disbelief and ridicule, really, from the sub-postmasters that she could say that. And I think that is at the heart of what they really struggle with when she has given evidence, whether it's today or before MPs when she's spoken in the past, is that the contrition and saying how much these accounts of the suffering have affected her, well, that doesn't marry with the actions that the post office took, that they still pursued these people, even after they knew that there were warnings that something was wrong here, this wasn't right. Surely not all of these postmasters were having their hands in the till. And that is the thing that I think they really struggle with, is that they still carried on prosecuting their own people even after they were told this isn't right.
Tom, do you think there's a danger of this part of the inquiry turning into a witch hunt? Such has been the expectation from these 3 days, hearing evidence from Paula Vennells. She was the boss. These victims have waited a decade to hear her side of this. They are so desperate for accountability, and those we've heard from the post office up until this point in the inquiry have not given fulsome answers, can't remember certain bits, it was outside their job remit. There seems to have been a lot of avoidance and, just smoke and mirrors. At this point in the inquiry, from the top person at the post office for over a decade, they want something from her, don't they? Something tangible.
They do, and they want accountability, I think. For many of them, that will only be addressed when individuals are prosecuted in relation to their actions within this scandal. She was asked directly today, was this a conspiracy at the post office against the sub-postmasters? She denied that it was a conspiracy, but you speak to all of those people in the hall here today, they're quite convinced, in their view, that it was, and that there was this problematic culture within the post office that was, in the words of one of the solicitors for some of the victims, it was this cult, a kind of belief system that you go after these prosecutions because the post office was carrying out these prosecutions themselves. It's not a police thing, but they were going after their own people without stopping and looking at the evidence and listening to what people were saying, that surely I'm not the only one who's got these problems with this computer system.
It's taken decades for these sub-postmasters and mistresses to get to this point, Tom. So understandably, they are sceptical about Paula Vennells' evidence. Do you think that after her 3 days of evidence, we will be any closer to the truth?
It's hard to know, obviously, what she's going to say in the coming days. But I think based on today, it's largely what many of the sub-postmasters were expecting, in as much as it is, of course, that we've seen tears and Paula Vennells very upset at times during her evidence, but it's also quite controlled. And she is repeating many of the things that we've heard previously, that they didn't see this as a miscarriage of justice, that they believed what they were doing was right. We know it was anything but right. So I think maybe there are going to be things that still surprise us through the course of the rest of her evidence. It's a long time to be in a witness box, and I just take you back to that apology that she made at the start of her evidence today. She apologised for what was going to come down the tracks during this session of evidence that she's giving at the inquiry in London. So maybe there will be further bombshells in the coming days of what she knew. But the one thing that I think is really interesting, watching it with the sub-postmasters today, they know the detail of this scandal. They know the dates, the emails, the things that have been said in the past, and they are very quick to call them out when they believe what they're hearing isn't a full representation of what happened.
Tom, thank you. We'll take a pause there. After the break, we'll find out whether the sub-postmasters in the village hall today, 15 years on from that first meeting, felt they have had any answers from Paula Vennells so far. Welcome back to Fenny Compton Village Hall. In just a moment, I'll be hearing from those whose lives were ruined by this post office scandal. But first, let's talk more about the significance of where we are today, this little village hall in Fenny Compton, Warwickshire, as featured in the ITV drama Mr. Bates versus the Post Office. The first meeting of sub-postmasters happened right here back in 2009. And to talk more about that, I'm going to speak to Marion Holmes and Graham Ward, two of the victims in this scandal. Hello.
We're just having a cup of tea.
Oh, good. You need a cup of tea after what we've seen today, don't you? And Graham, what's it like to be back here? Because this is your first time back in this village hall since that meeting.
It's a bit different. It's a lot smaller than I remember it. And all I can think, us standing in the kitchen here, I just said, all I remember is Joe Hamilton and Suzanne handing out cakes and tea when we was here last time.
Yes. Looking back, we probably only came to one and maybe two here, and then we moved on to the other hall.
Changed so much, hasn't it, Marion?
Yeah.
And that's an indicator of just how much time has passed since that first meeting.
Yeah, here we are, back full circle. It's odd.
Graham, can you take us back to that first meeting? What was the feeling then compared to now?
Then it was just hope.
Yeah, I was just going to say more hope than
we just all got together.
Yeah.
We put the chairs in the circle and we was hoping that something was going to happen. There was about 20 odd people here. But from then it just grew and grew and grew, and then we had to split up because we had the northern band and the southern people.
Yeah.
Well, thank you both. Let's get back and watch more of the evidence, shall we?
Yeah. We'll be finishing soon, won't we?
Well, we've heard so much during this scandal about lives ruined, lives lost. And just when you think you can't be shocked anymore by these horrendous stories, I meet you, Nicole. Hello.
Hello.
Nicole, you have never spoken about what happened to you publicly or indeed privately, because we're sitting here now and you haven't even told, to this day, your family, and when I say family, I mean your husband and your children, about what happened. Why?
Because it was my problem. It was my problem. I was embarrassed. I thought it was my fault. I was doing something wrong. I knew I wasn't stealing, but I knew that there was something wrong, but I didn't know what was wrong, and I didn't want them to know. I didn't want them to be embarrassed by me. I didn't want it to come out, and I didn't want to tell people. So I just suffered it on my own.
For how long, Nicole?
15 years. I've not told anybody.
Well, now's your chance, Nicole. Tell us your story for the first time.
So my village shop and post office came up for sale. I borrowed the money to buy it. My mum and dad had just moved to the area. They'd just taken retirement and had a redundancy pay, and they said they'd go in with me and help me. So we took the shop on in the post office. I had a week's training in Leicester. My dad came with me every day to the training. And then he came back to the shop with me and we opened up. We put stock on credit cards and stuff like that just to try and get going. So I was in about week 2, and I mentioned to my dad that the computer just seemed to not tally with what I had in front of me. And he said, well, if that's the case, you've got no hope of me ever going in there, because I don't want that responsibility. So I carried on, and every time there was a shortage, I had to put the money in. Then it got bigger and it got bigger and it got bigger. We're talking thousands upon thousands. I had to sell my jewellery. My brother would lend me money. I'd take money out of the business, and it just got harder and harder. And I got to the stage that I was taken to my doctors because I said I wanted to put a sign outside the shop saying closed due to death in the family, and that death was going to be mine. A few months later, I was found in the hotel by the police. I'd attempted suicide because I just couldn't see a way out of it. I couldn't keep putting the money in that I was putting in. So I kept doing it and kept going and going. And I used to walk in, I'd have full-blown panic attacks, anxiety attacks. I'd be sitting crying my eyes out on the post office floor trying to work out what was going wrong. You'd phone the help desk, and it'd just be, no, it's only you, it's just a mistake.
Nicole, somehow, I don't know how, but you found the strength to face today, the significant day. Paula Vennells, finally, after a decade, publicly talking about what happened during that time. She started with an apology. How did you take that?
It was worthless. It was useless. That's not an apology. That doesn't help. If she was really sorry, she'd admit what's happened. She'd make sure we got the compensation and the redress that we all deserve, instead of spending millions fighting us innocent people. She'd spend the millions on paying us what we're entitled to, what wages we would have had, what debts we've had to pay, what money we've given to the post office. The reason life is so hard for me now is because of the post office. There are some days I do not get out of bed.
Nicole, what do you want to hear from Paula Vennells throughout the course of her evidence? Because we have another 2 days to come.
I'd like her to admit, I'm fed up with hearing, I don't recall, I don't remember. That's all we've heard throughout this whole inquiry. Oh, it wasn't my place, it wasn't my job. She was the CEO. The buck stops there. She would have known how many people were prosecuted. I'm glad that she's given back her CBE. She should have done that a long time ago. I'd love her to give her bonuses back to the people that deserve it. I would love to see her prosecuted, but I think it won't happen.
Nicole, thank you so much for sharing your story with us. Like you said, you haven't shared it with those closest to you. So for you to open up to us today is an indicator of just how significant today and the next couple of days are going to be. So thank you.
Thank you for bringing us here and letting us have this opportunity. It's been a really interesting day, and it's given me the strength to come forward, and I really appreciate you giving me that opportunity.
Can I have a hug?
Of course you can. Don't, because I'm going to start crying.
I think we both need one after that. Thank you so much, Nicole. So many moving and powerful stories in this scandal, each one of them different, but each of them equally devastating. I want to say thank you to all of the sub-postmasters and mistresses who gathered here in Fenny Compton to join us today on Sky News. I'm Sarah Jane Mee. Thank you for listening to our special episode of the Sky News Daily. And don't forget to look out for an extra episode of The Daily today. Neil Patterson and our Deputy Political Editor Sam Coates unpick Rishi Sunak's surprise announcement that the country will go to the polls with a July 4th general election. We're back tomorrow.